Alright, so I wanted to talk to y'all about something today that's becoming real prevalent, and I'm afraid it's going to get to the point where it's an epidemic. I had a friend at the shooting range. We were shooting there to shoot a match, and I just saw him with his gun and saw that he had some stippling done, and I asked him to see his gun. And when he handed it to me, I noticed something right off. It had an aftermarket trigger put in it, and not sure what brand. Really, it's irrelevant what brand, but you know, the frame kind of hair's been butchered up a little bit. But look at this aftermarket trigger. It's a flat face. Can you see no trigger safety protruding from the front of the trigger? Okay, now I told him his gun wasn't safe. I want to just show you a little demonstration here, and let's just say this. This is actually a Gen 2 Glock. This is actually a Gen 2 Glock. This is some of you may recognize it. It's my wife Mary's Model 19, and let's say Mary comes home from out doing whatever, and she goes to take her pistol out of her holster, and she fumble fingers and it hits the floor. Whoops. Alright, it hits the floor. Nothing happens. Now let's say my pal, he comes home, he decides to take his gun off, hopefully not in my house with my wife there, but he fumble fingers it and drops it in. Did y'all hear that? I had a primed case in there. I also had a primed case in my wife's Gen 2 Glock 19. Folks, if this had happened and my friend had shot himself or somebody else, all you would read in the newspaper would be man drops Glock pistol and it discharges injuring someone. This is not a Glock. Okay, it's been monkeyed with and messed around with until a safety was bypassed. People cut so much of the striker surface away. They buff and they polish everything. They put a really light trigger spring in here, and these things can be dangerous. Glock is one of the safest pistols in the world. But when folks go to monkeying with them, it's what you get. Now, I've got, thanks to Glockmeister, we're going to put this thing back in all original condition today. I can't do nothing about them butchering up the trigger guard right there. I guess somebody could build that up with some epoxy. But we're going to put this back to where it's one of the safest and most reliable pistols on the planet. And all right, so I want to finish up real quick on that video that I started yesterday morning when we were out here. Believe it or not, we were out here at 8 o'clock doing that video, and it was already so hot that my iPhone shut down because of the temperature. So we couldn't wait for it to cool down because we had planned on going shooting tomorrow, or yesterday, so that's what we did. Planning on going shooting tomorrow too, by the way. But let me just say this. You saw the Glock fire. I had a primed case in there. You saw the Glock fire when I slammed it down on this 2x4. And you saw that my Mary's old one didn't. It still works fine. The trigger safety's in place. Everything works like it was designed to do. You guys that are putting these aftermarket triggers in there for these people, if they drop their gun and it shoots them, they're coming to get you. You're the one that's going to be sued. I know how simple Glocks are to take apart and put back together. Just because you can do that and you have a Dremel tool does not make you a gunsmith. You need to be aware that you are putting people's lives at risk by putting these triggers in these guns. And I was just at the range about 3 months ago and saw a guy drop the slide on a Glock, using the slide release, had a full magazine in place. The gun fired. Thankfully, when he dropped the slide, he had it pointed out in front of him, but I was looking right at him when it happened. He didn't have his finger on the trigger. I took the gun apart. He went about as white as a ghost. I took the top off the gun and looked at it. It had an aftermarket trigger in it, and everything was so loose in there that when I pulled the trigger on the gun with the top off of it, I could see the trigger bar, the cruciform, everything along the line of that trigger bar was actually cocking sideways when you would put pressure on the trigger. Sometimes the gun would remain pre-staged when you fire a shot, and sometimes it wouldn't. It was a mess. I asked him if he had the factory parts, and he said no, the guy that put the trigger in for him kept the factory parts. I want you to know, if you buy a used Glock, that you can send it to Glock. They will put all the Glock brand new spec parts in it. They will spec everything out, make sure everything's right. They will send it back to you, post-paid, right back to you, not to a gunsmith, because it's your gun and you send it to them. They're allowed to send it back to you, and they'll make sure it's right. Now, if you send them one like the one we had yesterday where the trigger guard was butchered up, I don't know if they'll work on that gun. The trigger guard was cut so thin that it actually flexes when you give just a little pressure on it, and I'm sure that that's not the way Gaston Glock designed it to be. I'm sure the engineers that worked on that gun decided how thick that trigger guard needed to be, and so I don't know what they'll do in that situation. But when you take a gun like a Glock, for example, compare that to a 1911. A 1911 Colt has got 52 pieces in it, not counting the magazine. It's got 52 parts that make up a 1911 Colt. The Glock, if you don't count that magazine, has 31 pieces. That means that in a Glock, to do the same thing that Colt does, some of those parts do 2 or 3 different things. Well, when one of these so-called gunsmiths goes to whittling or grinding or polishing on something, they're thinking about what it does to the trigger pull, and they're not stopping and thinking about what it might do to the other things that part does. Glock is one of the safest pistols in the world. I already mentioned that in the tape yesterday morning, or in the video. We don't use tape anymore, I get it. But you take any one of those parts, serves 2 or 3 different functions, and by monkeying with one, you're affecting some of the others. Glock's already up against it because everybody says, well, a Glock don't have a safety. I don't like Glock because it doesn't have a safety. Glock has 3 safeties. Like a Smith & Wesson K-frame revolver, it has passive safeties. If you squeeze the trigger all the way to the rear, it overrides 3 safeties in sequence. If they're even redundant, thank goodness, if one of those quits working, the other 2 will still work. They're redundant, so thank goodness for that. But just keep in mind that when you go to messing with a pistol and you really don't know what all the parts do, you're taking a big risk. So, you know, don't do it. Now, I'm not a gunsmith. I work on my own guns. I've been doing it. I made my first ejector from a piece of spring steel for a Model 25 Glenfield 22 when I was 11 years old. And I work on my own guns. I don't do work for people. I will put you a brand new part in, but that's not gunsmithing. You know, you buy drop-in parts and you drop them in, that's not gunsmithing. And if those parts aren't drop-in, you need a gunsmith. You need somebody that actually knows all the things that that part does, not just the one you want to work on. So keep that in mind, and you know, guys, quit butchering up these guns. These guns are made out of the box. They're the most reliable and one of the safest pistols on the planet. And just because you can buy a ton of aftermarket parts for them does not mean you need them. Learn to shoot that daggone thing, okay? The money, the 150 bucks you're going to spend on that stinking trigger will buy you 1,000 rounds of ammo. That's what you need to do. Quit monkeying with these guns.